Lord, let your mercy be on us as we place our trust in you. The response to today's psalm. And as I was thinking about this over the course of the last week or so, a question came to my mind. And the question was simply this: do we, really place our trust in the Lord? Well, it's Lent, the second Sunday of Lent. And it's an opportunity for us to really reflect on our relationship with God and with Jesus. An opportunity to do something a little bit different than we do throughout most of the year. Last week's gospel story was about temptation, and this week's about witnessing the Transfiguration. Two very different stories. But in light of the psalm today, two stories that should make us ask ourselves some questions. Questions about trust, questions about relationship. And not just for ourselves, but we need to ask these questions as individuals, as families, and as a community. Do we really value our relationship with God and our relationship with Jesus? Do we really trust him with everything? Now, before I go any further, I do want to apologize because I know I'm speaking to the choir to a large extent. I'm preaching to people that come to church and clearly do value their relationship with God and with Jesus, and they do place trust in God and in Jesus. So the question for those of us here today is probably a little bit different. I know for me it is. The question for me today, and I hope for you, is, do I really place my trust in God? Or can I trust him more fully? Are there things that I deal with in life that if I were to give them to God would just be that much easier to deal with? Well, Father Joe reminded us last week that Jesus certainly does know what we go through. He knows the temptations that we face, and he's always there with us to help us through those challenging moments. But we need to be open to accepting his help. And this week, we see it a little bit differently. We see Peter, James, and John witness the Transfiguration. They witness Jesus change from the man that they knew into this dazzling being, standing on a mountainside, speaking to Moses and to Elijah. Imagine the temptation they felt to go run and tell everyone they knew what they had just witnessed. So much so, they wanted to build 3 tents. Tents that would help to mark the spot, if you will, where they saw this. Tents that would allow others to go back to that same place and perhaps feel some of what they were feeling at that moment. But then we see that their relationship with Jesus is certainly a strong relationship. So strong, in fact, that when Jesus says to them, "Do not tell the vision to anyone until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead," they did as he asked. They didn't do what temptation would cause them to do. They didn't run and tell everyone for the recognition. They didn't run and tell everyone because they were so excited about it. They listened. They did as Jesus asked. And they did it, probably not really understanding what he meant when he said, "Until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." So let me ask again, and I ask myself this, I've asked it a lot this week. Do I really place my trust in God and in Jesus? As I've said to you in the past, when I ask a question like that, I can only answer it for myself. But I can tell you that I certainly could trust him more. But it's hard, especially when whatever the temptation is that's in front of me is a big temptation. It's a strong pull to do something. And the reward for giving in to that temptation is immediate. It's so much easier to do what we know we're going to get rewarded for than it is to focus on something, hopefully, in our distant future. And now, as we look at our community, a group of people that we might have some influence over, we can really ask ourselves the same question, but on a much greater scale. When we ask, how much does our community trust in God? How much does our community value its relationship with God? Well, I think if we take a minute and just look at some simple things, we can easily see that our community doesn't value that relationship as much as it probably should. More appropriately, I think we can see that the answer is the temptation to live a secular life, the temptation to do what society tells us is a good thing, is often stronger. It's often more important to us, at least in the moment, than the relationship that our community has with God. And it happens really for that very simple reason, that the reward for following that temptation or giving into the temptation is immediate. And the reward for doing what God calls us to do is sometime in the future. Now, I'm not here to criticize what anyone does or any decisions anyone makes. I make enough poor decisions on my own. But I do think, as a community, we need to start asking some questions. Some simple questions, really. Which is more important? Getting to a sports practice? Coming to Mass? Which is more important? Getting our family together, getting our children together, and coming to Mass as a family, or allowing our young adults, our teenagers, to sleep in, because it's easier than fighting with them. And I promise you, I failed there. It's easier when the youngest one is 27. They do what they want. Or how about when we're traveling or when our schedules just get so full that we can't find time to go to the Mass that we'd like to go to? Do we look to find a church that has a Mass time that we can get to, even if it's a little bit inconvenient? Or do we just skip Mass that week because it's so much easier? I guess what it really comes down to, at least for me, is how important is that relationship with God? And how much are we willing to give up for that relationship? And so as we continue our Lenten journey, we have a perfect opportunity to reflect on this relationship and to ask ourselves, which is more important? Seeking the immediate reward that comes from giving in to the temptation? Or working on our relationship with God and with Jesus so that we can be more like Peter, James, and John, who did as Jesus asked, didn't do what they felt they should do or wanted to do, because they were focused on the eternal reward rather than the immediate.